Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, ready for Everyday Liberties current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis and ready for Everyday Liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C. I hear that it has already started snowing in parts of Central Asia. This means it's going to be a long winter this year, and that is a bad news. Bad news because people will need more energy to survive, and the region is already facing an acute energy crisis. Cities going dark at night. That's also bad news for food security because the number of countries in the region is already short of supplies. It was a dry year in Central Asia, so we are also talking about the possibility of shortage of water this year. Because of the COVID-19, the remittances were dropped throughout the region, and this is a lifeline for lots of people. So we are also talking about lack of resources and means. So shortages. Though we speak about similar challenges every year, this year Central Asia seems to be facing multiple challenges at the same time on a whole different level. So how the region is preparing for this? To discuss all these, I'm joined by Janibek Omorov, international energy economist, Farooq Yusufi, the director of Ready for Everyday Liberties Turkmen Service, Bruce Pannier, the editor of Ready for Everyday Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today in this important conversation. So, Janibek, you are from Bishkek, and Kyrgyzstan is one of those places in Central Asia where there is nothing new about the energy crisis. So let's start with you. So beyond living those challenges in person, you have a profound background in researching this matter as part of your profession. So we will get to your scientific research and findings momentarily. But to kick off the conversation, please tell us, Janibek, as the temperature already dropping below zero in some of these places in Central Asia, including your country, what are the early signs in terms of impending challenges on energy supply in Kyrgyzstan?
Kyrgyzstan energy sector has already facing systemic problems in the recent years. And of course, the regional and the international this energy crisis adding to these issues. So, I can say that there are two group of problems. As I say, it is regional problems, of course, which is impacting the situation, and international issues that Kyrgyzstan is trying to solve, utilizing its own resources.
So, Janibek, we are certainly going to talk about the possible reasons behind what is happening in the background. But as we speak, what is the impact of energy crisis there in Kyrgyzstan? How you see this impact as we speak?
Yes, impact is going to be really severe because Kyrgyzstan used to export quite a bit of electricity in the region, but now, due to this accumulated problems in the power sector, it is already energy deficiency in the country and experiencing lack of electricity for its own demand. So we already starting some switching off electricity in some parts of the country. And certainly the heavy dependence on hydrology, so it's also impacting greatly because of dry year and the low hydrology cycle. The energy production is expected to be much lower compared to the previous years.
Very interesting. Okay, so it's a quite a achievement from being an energy exporter and now in need of energy to fulfill local demands in Kyrgyzstan. So certainly we are going to talk about the reasons and about where the country is as we speak. Before that, let's take views about the rest of the region. Perhaps, Farooq, Turkmenistan is a gas-rich country, and I do not anticipate that this country to have any problem with the heating energy of any sort. So how's the situation there?
So one would think that Turkmenistan would be doing much better than other countries in the region, but as we see, that Turkmenistan is not doing well these days. The biggest problem for Turkmenistan at the moment is that they don't have the infrastructure. The power grids were not renovated since Soviet times, and that's the biggest problem. The outdated equipment, outdated stations, they see accidents and breaking down. People in many regions of Turkmenistan, people get a very limited amount of electricity, and the power of that electricity. We have the standards 220. It's way below. It's like in countries like the United States where they have 110, but they have the matching equipment. But in Turkmenistan, when the power of electricity drops to below 150, then you have problems like in your everyday life. As I said, on top of that, we've seen a lot of power outages during the year, even for several days in a row. People didn't have electricity at their homes, so it's not doing very well. At the same time, Afghanistan is increasing export of electricity.
That's what I was thinking about. Like, when locally they are facing this shortage of electricity in the country, they continue to export electricity to Afghanistan. Obviously, I think there was also a discussion with the Uzbek authorities to increase export to Uzbekistan, perhaps Tajikistan. Interesting dynamics there. So that's on electricity, Farouk. But gas, I mean, in the shortage of electricity, people most often rely on gas to address certain needs. And Turkmenistan is a gas-rich country. How is the gas supply going these days? I mean, it's not yet fully winter, but we expect Turkmenistan to have a cold winter as always. So how's the gas supply going these days?
The gas is also the same problem. Infrastructure is outdated. The pipelines that go to villages and districts, they're outdated. People don't get gas. As you know, a couple of years ago, Turkmenistan abolished the benefits for free gas and electricity and water for the population. And they started installing gas measurement equipment and electricity measurement equipment. And even for money, people don't get gas or electricity. And to add on that, proper drinking water.
Interesting. So energy is obviously a big challenge. Bruce, I just went through your piece on Radio Free Liberty from last week, I guess, about the drastic measures that the authorities are taking, including cities going dark, I guess, where you were talking about Kyrgyzstan in the story. As I understand, the electricity shortage is what we see on the surface, but we are also talking about package of problems here, I guess. I mean, earlier, Janibek was trying to hint to, but we are going to talk about that. But before going through all those packages of problems, what about Uzbekistan, the most populous country in Central Asia, and also about Kazakhstan, the richest country in Central Asia? How these things are factored in there?
Well, I'll start with Kazakhstan, just because like 2 weeks ago, they had power outages from the Ekibastus, and those are coal-fired thermal power plants that are in the northeast part of the country. You know, they also date back to the Soviet era, but not total failure. I mean, you know, they have to be clear about that. I mean, the whole plant didn't shut down, but there was significant drop in the amount of electricity suddenly they were producing up there. And the company Samruk Energo explained later, they said, well, we're repairing some of the units at Ekibastus 1 and Ekibastus 2, so the power reduction went down. And they admitted that there was other problems with another power plant that they have up there where something went offline and that caused failures. But the interesting thing about their explanation about the repairs was that it came after the problem happened. You know, usually if you were going to shut down some of your units or reduce energy, you would tell people that on, you know, in this case, I think it was the 15th of October, you can expect to have reductions in power and possibly temporary outages. But, you know, there was no warning that this was going to happen. It happened first, which suggests that it wasn't planned, and it might not have been part of repairs for that. You know, now last year, Uzbekistan has been real cautious about this. For one, President Mirziyoyev already announced that they wouldn't export any gas at all this year. He waited last year until I think late December before he said that, after they were in the midst of a crisis. But so they're already trying to get ahead of this, and he said no gas exports at all. It means a loss of money for them, but he wants all that gas to go to the domestic market to serve the energy needs of the people during this coming winter. Now that said, this year, just after the new year, in January, and they also suffered some major failures at a couple of their plants, and it led to this chain reaction where power was reduced at least a half a dozen plants, and it affected, because it was connected to the grid, to wider grids, it affected power supplies to southern Kazakhstan and power supplies to Afghanistan also. Yeah. Now, hopefully they got this patched up, but patched up is really the word here, because most of this, as Farouk mentioned a minute ago too, almost all these power lines and most of these power plants date back to the Soviet era, and some of them go back to the 1950s. So while they've been kind of keeping things held together, even though they talk about investing in these plants, they don't seem to have invested sufficient money in modernization and the replacement of equipment at the plants, replacement of the transmission power lines. The Asian Development Bank, other people have given them money specifically to do that. But we still end up in a situation where these plants are aging and they're really unpredictable. You never know when some of these things are going to go offline. And like I said, in the case of Uzbekistan, it led to a chain reaction that affected a much wider area, not only of Uzbekistan, but of neighboring countries.
No, that's very interesting what you hinted, Bruce, like in terms of, these investment going into this sector, but still we do not see improvement. Certainly we are going to talk about this, and this is Johnny Beck's area, and we are going to hear his thoughts on that, why it is what it is. One more point, Bruce, and of course we need to talk about Tajikistan. It's one of the very problematic countries in terms of the energy efficiency there. I mean, they are planning to export electricity to Afghanistan, but in the meantime, I just heard today is Friday, today there was an announcement in Tajikistan in terms of the price hike of gas, petrol, I guess also included electricity. So what's going on with Tajikistan in terms of the energy supplies as we are headed to winter, where they are in terms of the availability of those sources?
Okay, to separate two things here. The price of petrol for your tank, actually has been going up, across, I think pretty much across Central Asia. I couldn't speak for Turkmenistan so much, but certainly Kyrgyzstan, and Johnny Beck will be aware of this, that the price has gone up for gasoline at the pumps. And Tajikistan, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's gone up, I even saw that one of the stories from Azadi today was saying that, people can't even afford to fill up their tank with gas to go to funerals for family members. It's gotten to be that bad. So this is another problem. Of course, we know that the price of oil has been going up, and Central Asia is not immune to that. They get their oil mainly from Russia or Kazakhstan, so they got that problem. It's been enough of a problem that they've canceled flights at Almaty because they don't have enough jet fuel too. There's been a few flights that were canceled because they said that was the reason. They just didn't have fuel for the planes. Now as far as home heating and electricity, Tajikistan is much more closed mouth, and it's hard to get information out of this. They must surely be facing the same problems that Kyrgyzstan is facing, where they did not get enough water in their reservoirs. Now we know that winter is traditionally the time when you let the water collect in your reservoirs, and you're hoping to use that in the spring and summer and early autumn to generate electricity. They haven't said yet publicly that they're low, but then again, it's just getting to be the cold part of the year, and every year they have these kind of problems. Now they do have the new thermal power plant that the Chinese built in Dushanbe, and this is another problem too, and Johnny Beck would know this also from the thermal power plant in Bishkek, is that when they can't make up the difference through hydropower or imported electricity, the go-to source is coal. And so that's why you end up with Bishkek being one of the most, having some of the worst air pollution in the world, and Dushanbe getting up there too, is because they have these coal-fired thermal power plants that they have to turn to. And it was only 10 or 15 years ago that almost all these countries were saying we're going to switch these to some other form of fuel, natural gas if we can get it, but something else. And then they just gave up. As of 7-8 years ago, they could see that they just couldn't convert over to another source of fuel, and all of them, including Kazakhstan, not counting Turkmenistan, they have enough gas reserves, they don't need to burn coal, and they don't have that much coal, but everybody else has actually increased coal production in the last 10 years.
The air pollution, of course, a very interesting topic. I mean, in some countries, there are some possible alternatives, like, for example, in Turkmenistan, gas, although Farouk is saying that even gas is short these days. But in Kyrgyzstan is facing energy crisis, a shortage of energy, electricity, and also short of gas, Johnny Beck. What are the alternatives that Kyrgyzstan is relying to remedy this shortage? And Bruce hinted coal, and of course, it has its own consequences.
Okay, so due to this energy crisis and the energy deficit that Kyrgyzstan is severely experiencing, especially this year, what the country is trying to do now, they are exporting more electricity from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and even Turkmenistan. And then secondly, as Bruce mentioned, coal production is getting increased by coal-fired thermal plant. which creates, of course, additional pollution, which is already a severe problem in Bishkek, as you may have heard.
Yeah.
And then, of course, government is calling population to save energy and even trying to switch off street lights where are not, wherever is possible.
Yeah.
So this type of extreme measures are being taken. Of course, Kyrgyzstan is facing these problems because of accumulated problems in the power sector, as well as regional issues like trade and this ineffective economic cooperation. All those have created this problem that Kyrgyzstan is getting into this severe crisis now.
Mm-hmm. You hinted about this accumulated problem. I guess we need to talk about this maybe just in a second. But before that, let me take a kind of short pause here. We ended up talking too much about energy in the first half of the conversation today. There are so many other challenges associated with winter in Central Asia usually, and this is particularly true for this winter. So let's also talk about them a little bit and how the region is coping on this aspect. We will continue the conversation talking about these and many other questions very shortly. First, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis podcast, we are discussing food and energy security in Central Asia. Joining me in the discussion are Janibek Omorov, international energy economist, Farukh Yusufi, the director of Radio Free the Liberties Turkmen service, locally known as Azatlik, Bruce Pannier, the author of Radio Free the Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. I'm Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free the Liberties media manager and host of the Majlis here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing the food and energy shortages in Central Asia ahead of winter. So food shortages, before food shortages, Janibek, just to continue with you, as I said earlier, you hinted a couple of times in terms of the why Kyrgyzstan is facing in the energy sector alone what it is facing today. So in terms of the reasons, in terms of whys and what is, can you briefly talk us through what is that Kyrgyzstan is getting wrong about this? Earlier we were talking about this with Bruce Pannier, and as you will know better than both of us, there has been money made available to improve energy sector in Kyrgyzstan. Some of them came from Asian Development Bank, some are from other international financial institutions. Why it is getting worse every year?
Yeah, it is true. Despite that, Kyrgyzstan has a great potential of producing low-cost hydroelectricity and trading in the region, which would be beneficial for all countries of Central Asia, but which has not been happening, unfortunately, in the past. For various reasons. First of all, of course, a lack of efficient cooperation in the region and this trade barriers, despite that the region has economic and the custom unions, so you can see not only electricity trade, but the trade of goods and the services are facing a lot of barriers. If you look at border between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, you can see frequently long lines of trucks just stuck there because of Kazakhstan not allowing them pass smoothly. So this all created economic disadvantage and lack of income for power companies and for population who cannot afford higher tariff. So what has happened since then, of course, Kyrgyzstan tariff is very low because of the social issues, and the tariff issues has become very social and politicized there. Of course, for economic development, you would set up tariff based on the economic efficiency and the independent regulator. But at the moment,
Janibek, I know the way you are describing this situation perfectly makes sense. But for us to understand, all this money that goes into improving energy sector, all this money that Kyrgyzstan gets from international institutions to improve the energy sector, but the energy sector is going downward. Why is that? I understand the problem with the border, and I understand the intergovernmental cooperation problem within the region, but some funds made available for Kyrgyzstan to improve energy sector, and it is not improving, it's going downward. Why is that?
It is, of course, there has been a lot of loan Kyrgyzstan is getting from external financing sources. You're absolutely right, but it is not sufficient. Of course, the energy companies has to repay all these loans and interest rates, but they are facing these financial issues because of the low tariffs and the low revenues. So they cannot get sufficient financing. That's one of the major problems for the power sector and for the government, who is trying to help out with the crisis. And of course, I mean, this situation and all these trade issues are creating social problems that population cannot afford higher tariff. Secondly, this low tariff is creating another problem, so it is not attracting private sector. So for countries like Kyrgyzstan, the most driver would be private sector, because we have a lot of investment, because the energy sector requires very high level of investment. So government never can do this. So the sector is not attractive to private sector because of low tariffs, and the investment returns are low.
Okay.
And of course, another problem is creating, so renewable energy is not being developed as well. At the moment, less than 1% of Kyrgyzstan energy production, I mean, not considering the big dams, only less than 1% is renewable energy. So these types of things are creating the crisis, which is getting deeper and deeper every year.
Okay. Bruce, you have been looking into this sector in Kyrgyzstan in your recent writings. If there's anything you would like to add in addition to what Janibek has said, please feel free. And what I understand Janibek telling us is financial sustainability is a big question there in Kyrgyzstan in terms of the this energy sector. But in Kazakhstan, you said earlier, they are also facing electricity shortages, and they have no problem with finance, Bruce. I mean, Kazakhstan is a rich country. Then why Kazakhstan is facing this issue?
Yeah, well, see, this is a really good question, because like you said, it's not that they're short of funds. They don't seem to have allocated sufficient money to, overhauling and modernizing some of these plants. Like I said, Ekibastuz is the one that I always come back to because it's one of the oldest ones they got. But, that's a Soviet era plant. It's a coal-fired plant, and Kazakhstan could easily invest a couple $100 million in that and modernize it. And also at the same time, do some more filtering and trapping of coal emissions so that the air would be a little bit cleaner too. But for some reason or another, that doesn't seem to have happened, or certainly not to the degree that it should have happened. And I was at a presentation a couple of years ago that the Asian Development Bank did about that too. Kazakhstan's transmission power lines, right? And again, this is a fairly well-to-do country by Central Asian standards. It's the richest country, as you mentioned. Sometimes the loss of electricity on the transmission lines can be 15% or more, which is obscene. It's really bad. People consider, that Johnny Beck would know this better than me, but if electricity diffuses, or if your shedding of electricity is under 10% as it moves across the country along these power lines, then that's more or less acceptable. But you hope that 100% of your electricity would go from the power plant to the homes that it's supposed to go to. That never happens. But when you have over 10%, and like I said, in some cases in Kazakhstan, it's 15%, that is just lost electricity. That just diffuses from the power lines as it's moving from the power station to its destination, homes, businesses, whatever. And then they haven't replaced those either. This is something that the CARET program, the Central Asia Regional Economic Program, specifically gave money to all these countries to put new power transmission lines in.
That puzzles me, Bruce. Why is that? Why this reluctancy there in terms of even spending money which is available? Why they don't do that? And every year they keep facing this energy shortages when the winter comes.
That's a good question. And since obviously internal investigations haven't uncovered anything, and that there's no public stated reason, you'd have to assume that corruption has siphoned off a lot of this money. Otherwise, it does not make sense. Why? In some countries' cases, hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into these kind of projects. And yet still, not only are we facing the same problems, but as you mentioned in the case of Kyrgyzstan, and it's not just Kyrgyzstan, some of these problems have actually gotten worse. But I do want to agree with Johnny Beck about tariffs and what the cost of utilities being the root of all these problems, because, the government's part of an understanding, and Turkmenistan's not exempt from this either, remembering that they used to distribute gas for free. And why? Because this is a way of keeping your population content to a certain degree. They might live poorly, but they get this benefit. And governments are real reluctant in Kyrgyzstan and absolutely in Tajikistan to raise the rates the consumer pays for electricity because they're afraid it'll lead to unrest. The state energy company of Tajikistan, Barki Tajik, is constantly in debt because people don't pay very much for their electricity, and they're not paying on time, and the government continually writes off those debts. I mean, they run into the tens of millions of dollars all the time, and when the state energy company can't pay, the Tajik government eventually says, okay, forget it. Well, forget it. As Johnny Beck said, that's ridiculous because you can't improve your domestic power system unless you're getting money back from the consumer. But the money they spend, they get not even half of that comes back from payments from consumers. So it's just an impossible cycle to get out of. Unfortunately, the governments are afraid they'll be overthrown if they raise the rate to a point where they can actually make it cost effective to provide electricity to the population and maintain the systems. And in the meantime, when they won't raise the electricity, it just means that the systems continue to deteriorate.
So just to add to what Bruce said, if possible, Mohammed. So the pricing of electricity in Kyrgyzstan is they are selling, most of the electricity under $0.01 per kilowatt hour. Whereas, in other Central Asian or CIS countries, the average price of electricity around 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And in South Asia, where now Kyrgyzstan is trying to export this, of course, retail price is around 8%, in the US in 10 cents, and in Europe 30 cents. So you can imagine how cheaply the electricity is charged in Kyrgyzstan due to economic and the social issues. And of course, another problem is the export prices. So, of course, Bruce also mentioned about this corruption and the other issues that are influencing this economic trade and the prosperity of the region. So Kyrgyzstan electricity exports, they kept the price for many years, 1 cent per kilowatt hour, which is a very low price compared to, worldwide, even to the region. And now the price has come up to around 2.4 US cents per kilowatt hour, because Kyrgyzstan now is trying to export electricity for, normal full price to the South Asia at price over 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Mm-hmm. Now the Kazakhstan is raising slowly to 2.4 US cents per kilowatt hour. Mm-hmm. So, where normal economic cooperation situation, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan would be interested to buy more electricity from Kyrgyzstan, which is much cleaner, which is hydro-based. Whereas in Kazakhstan, mostly it's coal-based, and in Uzbekistan, gas-based electricity. And then encourage development of hydro and the clean energy in Kyrgyzstan, which is unfortunately is not happening. That's why it's suffering not only the Kyrgyz economy, but the whole region, and not getting advantage of the situation.
Yeah, I think, it's going to be a long conversation than I expected. It's just the problem is as such that there is no easy way out of this situation. But also, this is not a solution to keep this problem growing every year, accelerating every year. In some point, somebody has to take a hard look into this. So I don't know who will do that and what kind of consequences that will generate. We will see. But we spoke about the tariff as being part of the problem here. Okay, understand in terms of electricity, but we are also facing food shortages. Like we have seen price hikes going up recently. Farouk, I have seen these kind of reportings coming out from the Turkmen service, from your service. Tell us about some of those issues.
Yeah, according to what the Turkmens are telling us, the population is telling us the situation is very serious. They call it a famine. They compare it with the situation that was in Turkmenistan in early 1990s after the country became independent and people had difficult times. But this time they say it's even worse. And the problem with the Turkmenistan's shortages has several main reasons. One is that Turkmenistan had this and still has this system of state stores where Turkmen authorities claim that they provide subsidized food, but the shortage of subsidized food is severe. They cannot at the moment provide the population with those subsidized food because the Turkmen economy is in deep crisis. And on the other hand, people cannot afford buying food in markets from the private seller, because the prices, as you already mentioned, they're going high. The reason for that is that Turkmenistan has official dollar rate and unofficial dollar rate, and the difference between them is 7-8 times. and those private sellers import food staples on unofficial black market trade. And people in Turkmenistan, most of whom are employed by state organizations, they get their salaries accounted in official rate. That's why they can only afford buying subsidized food, and the variety of the subsidized food is very limited too. It's like chicken thighs, eggs, flour, bread. We see very long food queues for those subsidized food, and authorities go to extent that when they sell those subsidized foods during the night time, like early in the morning at 4:30 or 5:30, people gather in front of the state stores and fight with each other to buy their share of food. And that's not even enough for the family of 5. They get just 1 kilo of chicken thigh, 10 eggs, 2 kilo of flour, and they can do that once in 10 days or once in 2 weeks. So that's one problem. Another problem is the unemployment. People don't have money. Even those who have money, they make very little money, so that they cannot freely go to a market or to a private store to buy food there. And also because of pandemic and because of the nature of the Turkmen government, they closed the borders. Even the import of the food by private vendors was limited, very much limited over the past year. So there is a big picture of a big problem that's taking place.
Yeah, package of problems, as I said earlier. Bruce, Tajikistan comes to my mind here, is also Uzbekistan, how they are tackling, with the food shortages or other shortages that might be associated with winter usually in Central Asia. How are they in those countries and how they are coping with it?
Well, I haven't heard too much out of Uzbekistan, but that's kind of unfair because they just held a presidential election, and there's no way in the world they would let food prices go up right before a presidential election. That doesn't happen anywhere in Central Asia. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks. But, certainly Tajikistan and even Kazakhstan, and this is all connected with the drought, of course. The food prices were already going way up during the summer, which is usually the time of plenty, right? That's harvest time. That's when everyone's got stuff. But it was already clear that the crops harvest was far smaller than it usually is, and so prices went up to deal with that. But again, at least that was the time when they were harvesting stuff. Now you can imagine as the months go on that this is going to be even worse. There was places, in Kazakhstan, for instance, where the price for basic foods like carrots or potatoes or something in the western part, which is dry and mostly desert or something, it went up to 7 times the normal price. That was in the summer when they could at least count on more food coming, or food was actually starting to be produced locally or at least domestically in Kazakhstan. So you think about what it's going to look like in late December, throughout January and into February. It is surely going to be really hard for most people to try to get enough money to be able to pay for all this stuff. And we've seen this already in Tajikistan too. Prices are going up. People are having a hard time trying to pay for it. The governments try to, just like they do in Turkmenistan, try to tell people there's a fixed limit on what you can charge. But when you're at the bazaar, you can't check every bazaar, and people are going to sell for what they can. And in some cases, they might have paid an exorbitant amount to get that food to bring it to the bazaar. So to break even on this, they're going to have to sell it for a high price. And if they want to get a little profit, then it's an extremely high price. And people are having a hard time coming up with that kind of money.
How's in Kyrgyzstan, Janivek? We understand with the problem with the electricity shortages, were as partly you mentioned, has to do with the tariffs and other things. But these food shortages or other shortages that our colleagues were talking about has nothing to do with tariff anymore, but it is short in rest of the region. How is this in Kyrgyzstan?
Kyrgyzstan, obviously, experiencing the price hikes because of inflation is going up as in the region. Not only for electricity tariff issues. And of course, there was some cases of food shortage similar what Bruce was describing. And of course, Kyrgyzstan is producing sufficient for its domestic supply and exporting a lot to Russia. But still, due to COVID pandemic issues, so experienced these economic problems, and it caused some food shortages as well.
Bruce, how Tajikistan is coping with this year? I mean, as we say, Tajikistan also very much remittance-dependent country, and remittances have not been coming into Tajikistan this year as it used to in the pre-pandemic era. And we can also add into the problem the lack of resources, that affordability of people to buy stuff. So you have that additional problem is speaking at least for this year. So how's situation with food and other shortages in Tajikistan?
The one thing I would say about remittances is they were much worse last year. Certainly compared to 2020, the remittances so far in 2021 are higher. So that is at least something to provide some hope for people. Like I said, they're in a similar situation as Kyrgyzstan, although we don't get as much information about Tajikistan. Certainly they have drought. There's drought in Afghanistan, there's drought in Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan's in between. You don't have to be a math genius to figure out that they're in hard shape. We know that the price, as we mentioned earlier, the price for petrol has gone up, and that carries over. Tractors, things like that have to run on that. So they had a hot, dry summer. It's reflected in the prices at the market, and it's only the start, because like I said, we just got the harvest in the last 6-8 weeks or something. Everything's been coming in, so while it's obvious there's less, it's not as obvious now as it will be in 8 or 10 weeks from now how much less that is. The prices have gone up, but not as much as they're going to once people start buying all this stuff. And in the case of Tajikistan, President Rahman hasn't said it this year, but he's for 15 years now, almost every winter, he says he wants everyone to store up enough food to last them, in some cases for 2 years. But certainly, he's done this often enough that people probably are thinking about this, that to buy everything you can right now, which of course creates shortages later, but buy everything you can now, put it in your basement, whatever, so that you're ready to get through the whole winter.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up the conversations. You ended your comments speaking of winter. So what kind of winter are we anticipating to see in the face of all these challenges, problems? Johnny Beck, let's start with you, and then short comments from other participants today, and with that we will end the conversation.
I mean, yes, Kyrgyzstan obviously is watching and expecting what's going to happen in terms of weather condition in winter time. As you know, that the winter time is quite cold in the country, and there is consumption of electricity and the energy goes up almost by 3 times compared to summertime. So, and then facing this huge energy deficit this year due to all these issues, including the low hydrology cycle because of heavy dependence on hydro production of electricity. So there's going to be huge deficit of electricity because of a low level of water collection in the major reservoir of the country, Toktogul reservoir. And then, of course, Kyrgyzstan has taken some extreme steps to import electricity, as I mentioned earlier, and increase electricity production. It strongly depends how winter is going to be cold.
Okay. Bruce and Farouk, very short comments from you. With that, we will conclude the conversation. So what kind of winter are you expecting in terms of the challenges?
Yeah, just today we spoke with the specialists who deal with the heating systems in Ashgabat. They say that it's going to be very problematic for the population due to failing infrastructure, the pipes, the heating pipes that come to the homes of people. And on top of that, in Turkmenistan too, they're expecting that the prices for electricity will double according to the sources that are in the energy ministry in Turkmenistan. They say it's going to be very difficult, not only in the rural Turkmenistan, but also in Ashgabat and other major towns.
Okay, Bruce.
Well, considering the food problems and energy problems that are going on, if it's a mild winter, it'll be bad. If they get a sustained period or periods of cold weather where, it goes down -10, -20, 25 or something like that, and stays for 8-10 days at a time or something like that, it'll be absolutely horrible. It'll overload a lot of the power plants. The heating will be an issue. Electricity will be an issue. Food is almost surely going to be an issue, but at least if it's warmer, you can kind of deal with that a little bit better than if if it's -20 and you're hungry, that's really bad. Leads to all kinds of health problems and other issues too. So that's short answer. That's it.
Okay, with this, unfortunately, we have to conclude the conversation. Thank you very much, Bruce Pannier, the author of the Ready for Liberty Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi, Johnny Bek Omorov, international energy economist, and Farooq Yusufi, the director of Radio Free Alfredo Liberty's Turkmen service. Thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us today. And this is from me, Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis, Radio Free Alfredo Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. Until next week, bye-bye.